What I want to do is talk about one way of looking about ethics as a possible vehicle to try to mitigate and soften what I see as the harshness of discourse and communication in American life. And what this talk really does is present a very, very long introduction, basically trying to talk about aspects and nuances in our current moment, and sort of conclude with a way of thinking about ethics that I think, if we were to adopt it, would be salutary in terms of, again, assuaging some of the harshness that we see in public conversation in American life. I've titled my address, Ethics Over a Lifetime. I think we live in a time of foreboding and uncertainty, and I'm speaking primarily of our political moment. Who would have thought just a few years ago that our very democratic institutions would be imperiled, or that so many of our fellow Americans would fall under the sway of an ignorant, uncouth demagogue? But it is not merely the larger political forces that capture my attention. I'm concerned about the interpersonal relations that characterize the tone of American society. When I came of age politically in the 1960s, it was apparent that our politics was rooted in large political ideologies and social change. It was the era of mass movements, great disruptions, and vaunting hope. We were concerned with poverty and implementing broad social programs to overcome it. We experienced the anti-war movement set against the background of the Cold War and Soviet containment. And perhaps most tectonic, idealistic, and inspiring was the civil rights movement, which sought, and in a legal sense, at least succeeded in transforming the status of America's black population. With some exceptions, the politics of these movements was grounded at bottom in fundamental ideals and values, justice and equality, the most basic, and to be involved in these struggles, I found, when I came of age, to be inspiring and uplifting. The 60s certainly came with heavy doses, no doubt, of violence and ugliness. The counterculture was schooled in anti-authoritarianism and disrespect for older generations, which in great degrees transformed American culture and mores. And we had urban riots. But for those who were engaged in them, these movements also put forward grand visions of a more just society, a more perfect union, which had been the original promise of America. To a great extent, economic justice was interpreted on the left as the basis for social justice. Since that time, however, politics on the left has changed. We've experienced the emergence of the cultural left, with a heightened sensitivity to minority and previously excluded and marginalized groups, African Americans, women, gays, and others. Rather than emphasizing above all others the struggle for economic equality, American society has appropriated multiculturalism and the need for tolerance as a prevailing value. In many ways, this has been a good thing. In the words of the late philosopher Richard Rorty, the cultural left has, quote, reduced sadism in American life, or so it seemed. It's true that we've abandoned circus freak shows, and it's in bad taste to ridicule fat people. But as we all know, hatred of minorities has resurfaced with a fury few would have imagined. I must admit that with the election of Barack Obama, while I thought that the assumption voiced by some that we had become, quote, a post-racial society was simply preposterous, I did in fact believe that America was turning a corner, and Americans were working hard to put our legacy of racism behind us. But now I must confess, friends, with considerable embarrassment, that after the election of 2016 and the emergence of Donald Trump, that I personally was very tragically mistaken. I made a mistake, and I confess that. I confess my sins to you all. And I'm not the only one. Our politics has become divisive, raw, and nasty, and the expression of hatred now is validated by the highest powers in the land. All of this is worthy of the concern, I think, and condemnation of good people. But what I want to focus on this morning is another aspect of contemporary discourse, which is primarily an expression of the progressive end of politics with which I personally identify. What I'm referring to is a product of political correctness, which in my view sometimes goes too far. We see this on college campuses and in various sectors of public and political life. I want to look at this and bring to bear how our understanding of ethics might serve to mitigate a sensibility which I believe adds a dimension of edginess to our social and political relations. This discussion involves a considerable amount of nuance and complexity, and I by no means feel that I have the last word on it or that I have personally worked out my final thoughts. This is sort of the medias res, in the middle of the process of my trying to work this out for myself. What heightens the issue is that we have become more sensitive to the historical injustices and exclusions suffered by minorities and women and many others who are not identified as white, male, and privileged. Again, this is a very good thing. It is important to be sensitive to others and to the historical injustices that inform both oppression and privilege, depending on which end of the social hierarchy you stand on. Recognition of privilege and injustice is among the first and necessary steps at creating a more inclusive society and one less suffused with bigotry and discrimination. But it seems to me that it is not without its difficulties and problems. What concerns me here is that it seems as if our relations have become edgy and fraught, that people are at times too quick to take offense even when offense is not intended, and the response and condemnation often can be too categorical and too dismissive. Clearly, I am not talking about the ominous upsurge of white supremacy and blatant racism that needs to be condemned in the strongest terms possible. And there's no place for harassment and for threats, which are both dangerous, illegal, and need to be aggressively prosecuted. But what I'm talking about is speech of a different order. I'm speaking of the unintended discriminatory remark which ends up subjecting the person who makes it to a degree of condemnation and at times ostracization, which is, in my opinion, disproportionate and excessive, and ends up categorically labeling the person as racist or sexist, homophobe, Islamophobe, or whatever, when he or she deep down really may not be. An inappropriate remark can readily be amplified by being immediately lodged in and placed into an ideological framework, which for good reasons may be politically incorrect, but becomes vilified far beyond the intent or the significance of the remark itself. Say the wrong word, or perhaps engage in what is an unacceptable mode of behavior 20 years ago. A behavior, and I'm not here talking about violent or seriously transgressive behavior, and I'm not for a minute excusing Brett Kavanaugh, but a behavior one is truly left behind, and one may indeed find oneself currently vilified for that statement or act that took place at a different stage of life. There is a maxim that people should not be defined by the single worst thing that he or she has ever done. I believe this, and this is the prevailing point of my talk. But this dismissive tendency, I believe, is in our times ramped up by news outlets that seek ratings through sensationalization, and frankly the internet that appeals more to immediate impulsive reactions than to reflective, deliberative thought. Admittedly, this issue is complex and depends on context. Not all offensive remarks are the same or carry the same weight, and in my view, therefore, do not merit the same response. If a person indeed does have a history of discriminatory, bigoted behavior in what he says or does, it seems to me any bigoted remark he makes in the moment is far more significant than if he utters something that is simply thoughtless, impulsive, or stupid. But by any balanced reckoning is out of character, and I think it's important for the rest of society to notice the difference. My point is that I think social and public discourse has reached the point by which we are less circumspect about context than we need to be in order to be fair and in order not to inflame what is a tense social environment. Some remarks come with the full weight of hatred, which reveals a continuity of character by the perpetrator, and other remarks do not. A further point is that we are all fallible creatures, and we are all capable of saying things that are stupid and offensive, including those which we didn't mean to say and which cause us embarrassment and shame when we later reflect on them. I know that's true. I've said stupid things that have been hurtful to people in public, and when I reflect on them, I still have a pang of hurt that I have. I simply have not been able to expunge those things that I've done. And I think this is probably true. I don't think I'm the only one. I think this is part of the human condition, and we all have those feelings. And the universality of that fact, I think, ought to give us pause when we are prone to sit in judgment of others and readily hurl epithets at people for having uttered something which may be in some sense bigoted. In short, I think we have become too quick and too absolute in the propensity to sit in judgment of others. I realize that my taking this position is somewhat hazardous in that I am not a minority nor a woman and have not carried a history, a deep history of being on the victimized end of hatred and bigotry. I have indeed enjoyed that privilege, and I think we all like me, need to be sensitive. But there are different ways of looking at this. To make my point, take for example a recent incident that caught my attention that occurred involving Democratic Party candidate Andrew Yang, as reported recently in The Guardian. I don't know how many people saw this, but it caught my attention because it was so unusual in this political moment and basically illustrates the point that I'm trying to make. I found this incident again refreshing because it stands against the ethos of immediate condemnation that I find troubling and I'm trying to communicate. The article said as follows, and I'll quote from it. Quote, "The Democratic presidential contender Andrew Yang insisted on Sunday the words of a new Saturday Night Live cast member who called him, quote, a Jew chink." I don't know what a Jew chink is. A Jew chink should be taken in a slightly different light, okay? There have been, it goes on to say, there have been a number of reactions to my call, this is Yang speaking, there have been a number of reactions to my call for forgiving Shane Gillis, who was the comedian who was auditioning to become part of the new cadre of comedians on Saturday Night Live. There have been a number of reactions to my call for forgiving Shane Gillis, Yang said on CNN's State of the Union, and then he goes on to say, "I've experienced a lot of anti-Asian racism through my upbringing, and it hurts. It's something that's very real. I do think anti-Asian racial epithets are not taken as seriously as slurs against other groups." And that's the end of his quote. And the article goes on to say, but echoing a series of tweets, the tech entrepreneur added, quote, "At the same time, there's the bigger picture. I believe that our country has become excessively punitive and vindictive about remarks that people find offensive or racist. We need to try to move beyond that if we can, particularly in a case where the person is like a comedian whose words should be taken in a slightly different light." On Saturday, Yang tweeted, quote, "For the record, I do not think he should lose his job. We should benefit from being more forgiving than punitive. We are all human," end quote. And I found that very refreshing. Now, to be honest, put this in a more comprehensive light, Yang's example may not have been the best in that this particular comedian in question does seem to have a history, a long history of racist humor. But Yang's response drew considerable tension as well as criticism because it runs against, this is my point, the prevailing ethos of the moment. Absolute and immediate condemnation seems to characterize the prevailing proclivities of the day, but that's the point I want to make. I think that we need to be more supple, more nuanced, more contextually sensitive than the current moment leads us to be, while recognizing that each circumstance is going to be different and call for a different response. But I must admit that I again find something refreshing, indeed humanizing, in Yang's call for forgiveness rather than an almost dogmatic summoning of name-calling and condemnation and glibly placing and writing off the offender as if in the camp of the irredeemably racist, even if in this case it might perhaps have been misplaced. Believe me, this is not to validate racism. It is rather to be sensitive to contexts and not to paint every offense with the same brush. A few related thoughts here that I want to put out. Well, we need to be sensitive. I'm very concerned that words are cheap. It is just too easy for people to point a finger at others, condemn them for their racism and insensitivity, and achieve a smug sense of righteousness and superiority. There's this phenomenon I like to refer to as, quote, the narcissism of righteousness, which I think is something we should try to avoid. In many cases, the person we glibly condemn could readily be ourselves. It was Jesus who said, quote, "First cast out the beam out of thine own eye, and then you shall see clearly to cast out the mote out of your brother's eye," end quote. Well, we can take Jesus' admonition in two ways. First, be not too quick to judge, yes, lest ye be judged. But we can also, I think, interpret Jesus as a type of first-century psychotherapist, and that in that we take our own shortcomings and almost inevitably, at least in part, project them onto others, and therefore develop a distorted view of others. We are also, of course, I should say, within the 10 days of repentance in the Jewish calendar, when one is encouraged to introspect on ways in which he or she has offended the other, seek forgiveness, and engage in restitution, repentance, to demonstrate a change of heart that merits that forgiveness. In Judaism, to receive forgiveness from the one we have offended, the offender needs to do something, has to do something to demonstrate that there has been a true turning of the heart. In Hebrew, the word is teshuvah, which means a turning of the heart. Simply asking for forgiveness and readily receiving it is not sufficient. In the Jewish mode, there is no cheap grace, so to speak, which was a term the Protestant theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer had coined. There's no cheap grace. There's something about that I like very much. You have to demonstrate through an action that there has been a true turning of the heart before forgiveness can be rendered. My concern is that in these divisive times, we have lost sight of the need for forgiveness, and our social relations, as noted, have become excessively tense and brittle. Sensitivity to others is a good thing, a necessary thing. But human that we are, there will inevitably be times when we will fall short and not be as sensitive as we need to be to our better angels, not be as sensitive to what our better angels tell us we want to be. Increased anxiety that one may inadvertently offend at every turn, to walk on eggshells in society around these issues, is also not a good thing. And committing offense without the capacity for atonement and forgiveness, again, leaves society very brittle. But none of this is easy. It is the true nature of human society. Human beings are fractious. We're combative, we're adversarial, sometimes perversely so. And it's the nature of human society that there will be differences of opinion resulting in adversity, conflict, and offense. This is inevitable for human beings. I must confess here that I am a bit old school. I have long been a card-carrying member of the ACLU, and I must admit that I am a First Amendment and free speech romantic. Again, as a child of the 60s, I was identified with the New Left, but I was also socialized politically by a Supreme Court, which included such luminaries as William O. Douglas, Hugo Black, Thurgood Marshall, and New Jersey's own William Brennan. There were giants in the earth in those days, and thinking about those times fills me with a great deal of nostalgia. They were among my heroes and helped reconfirm me as a staunch civil libertarian. They socialized my view about civil liberties and freedom of speech and so on and so forth. So I ask, where have you gone, Joe DiMaggio? Our nation turns its lonely eyes to you. Simon and Garfunkel, for those who don't know. That's nostalgia also. Okay, there seem to be no more heroes. And I should say, although I've got to be a little careful about this, for me, in some sense, not every sense, don't get the wrong idea, that I'm truly, totally stuck in time. But for me, in some sense, the world ended in 1969, and everything afterwards has been a vague aftertime. You know? So don't take that all that seriously. But there's part of that is true, I hate to say it. You know? And so, I mean, that was the era of my socialization. Well, there's an adage the ACLU employs to the effect that the antidote to bad speech is not to prohibit or forbid speech, but rather the antidote to bad speech is more speech. Okay? I agree with that also. After all, if we're going to preemptively prohibit offensive speech, to whom are we going to entrust the power and authority to dictate what can and cannot be said? Whom do we trust to police our speech? Will it be the government, policed by Donald Trump and his Justice Department? Well, I think we should think twice before we are quick to call for official prohibition of speech, even if it's offensive or vilely offensive. Place in one scale an open society providing the widest berth to free speech, and leaving it to the people, to us ourselves, to establish civility and decorum as we will or won't, and in the other, in the other scale, give over that freedom to a sovereign power that will determine what the people, you and I, can and cannot say, and call that power the government, whose power is virtually limitless and ruled by people with their own political agendas and their own interests, the increasing oligarchs who run our government. And then ask yourself, which is the greater evil? Which society would you prefer to live in? I know where I stand in that regard, and nothing is perfect. There will always be offense in public discourse. I have no doubt that speech can offend and cause hurt. But I would also argue that to be, and this is my position, and some may disagree in these times, and this is part of the edginess of the moment, my position is, although words, speech can offend and hurt, I would argue that to be offended is not the worst thing in the world. Okay? It is rather the wages of living in a free society. Sorry to be arrogant, but if one is offended by the speech of others, maybe it is time to get a thicker skin or simply to scream back louder. Demanding that government prevent the speech from being uttered in the first place, I think, leads us down a dictatorial road that I dread to walk upon. Now, college campuses have become venues in which the issue of what can and cannot be said seems to have reached a very high pitch. I have taught in the academy, albeit part-time, for more than 30 years. And I've been a student at various levels, undergraduate, graduate level, and so on, for more years than I can count. Yes, yet I personally see little warrant why speech in a college environment, and especially in a college environment, should be circumscribed because it might personally or politically be offensive to some students. In the first instance, it curtails the value, I think, of academic freedom, which is the mainstay of academic environments. And secondly, the process of learning, I think, is predicated on being exposed, having students be exposed to ideas that they oppose, even find offensive, or believe are downright wrong. That's how people, in effect, grow intellectually, and society hopefully advances. I mean, read, for example, your John Stuart Mill, who is an advocate of open speech, free speech, on the grounds that we have to be exposed to wrong ideas, bad ideas, and hurtful ideas, because by that exposure and the dialectic of discourse in society, it gives us, in effect, an opportunity to refine our own position. Okay, it's critical for honing our own position to be exposed to a whole range of ideas, however bad those ideas or even offensive those ideas may be. I agree with that. I think that's how we grow, that's how we learn, and I don't want to see that process curtailed or cut off because some speech may indeed be offensive to some people for understandable reasons. I'm not dismissing it. Speech can be hurtful. Let me say, the call for censoring speech or particular speakers in college, in my personal experience, has primarily, and here this is a little subpoint, a footnote, and I'm speaking out of my own experience, teaching primarily in the graduate school at Columbia University, where I teach human rights, and I've done that for, I can't remember now. You know, you get older, you can't remember these. I think it's 19 years. It's a long time. It's coming on 20 years. Let me say, I think the call for censoring speech or particular speakers in college, in my personal experience, primarily has gone on not within classrooms, but outside of classes, involving guest speakers by various groups onto campus, and so on and so forth. And I'll tell you, I'll give you an example. You might be interested, and I could go on by this. It's a little bit off to the side. It's a little tangential. I teach courses in international human rights, and as such, I have a large number of foreign students. It's a lovely, my classes are absolutely marvelous. Very diverse, except for gender. If I have 24 students, I would say if I have 24 students, 21 of them are female. Okay, human rights is becoming a female-dominant field, right? It's true, which is, from my point of view, not bad. I mean, it's, you know, it's very nice. But they're international students, and a good number of them come from Arab and Muslim backgrounds. Okay, large number. And occasionally, when it's relevant, I will talk with them about Israel. Okay, now Israel has become one of those flashpoints on the extreme left where an anti-Israel position has become dogmatically, almost dogmatically required. This is not the position that I hold. Okay, I have a nuanced, balanced position of Israel on Israel, which I generally don't talk about, except in circumspect audiences. And so I'm taking a sort of, I don't think I'm taking too much of a risk here, but I've gotten hate mail for things that I've written in the press and so on Israel. I have a mixed picture on Israel. I think as a nation state, Israel is certainly worthy of criticism, as any is, for the violation of human rights. I think that the occupation on the West Bank and Gaza is cruel, humiliating, from Israel's point of view, is stupid, and a form of slow-burning suicide, and also is a violation of international law. And I'm perfectly able to say that, okay? I boycott the West Bank. I don't buy products, but I will not join the BDS movement, which I think is a veiled form of anti-Semitism, and others may disagree with that. But that's my position, and I will make my position known. But my primary critique is that although Israel is worthy of criticism for its treatment of the Palestinians, and I frankly lament that Israel internally has moved far to the right. Okay, it's part under Netanyahu. The left is almost gone in Israel now, and it's moved internally to the right, which I think is basically a denial of its founding vision, which was humanistic and liberal and so on and so forth. And I lament that. My position is that the international community, including the United Nations, and including the human rights community, of which I am a part, has a very unhealthy attitude towards Israel, and it has to do with the issue of proportionality and human rights. As a humanist, I believe that every human being counts. Yet in the international world, including in the human rights world, Israel is disproportionately singled out for condemnation, including the BDS movement, which calls for the ultimate annihilation of the Jewish state. And I ask myself the question, why is this the case? Okay, if you want to talk about human rights abuses, why is the human rights world and the left not so concerned about 6 million Congolese dying in warfare and over 100,000 women raped and gang raped? You don't hear about that very much. You don't hear proportionate criticism of Saudi Arabia that has no religious freedom. There isn't a single church in Saudi Arabia that has no religious freedom, and women are treated like children. Why isn't there condemnation of Pakistan, in which there are thousands of honor killings every year? And you want to know, we could go on and on, what the world's largest human rights violation is, which you know nothing about and never hear about, okay, in terms of the number of people. Arguably, and this is a little fanciful because it's hard to measure, I would say in terms of the number of people, the world's largest human rights violation is the institutional degradation and treatment of Dalits or untouchables in India, which number over 170 million. It is not as if they are consigned to cleaning latrines all their lives or can't walk out of humiliation in the shadow of a Brahmin. It is that they are routinely murdered, raped, and women have kerosene thrown in their faces, and this is done with impunity. The Indian government does not enforce this, and it goes on a massive scale. This is the life of Dalits, but you know what? One never hears from the human rights community much concern. There are specialists, of course, in various areas and NGOs, but generally speaking, this is not. But Israel commits an infraction, which is worthy of criticism, and indeed the world community comes down on it very harshly. The United Nations Human Rights Council has come up with something like 69 official rebukes or condemnations of Israel. The next country down the list, I forget where it is, like 30 or 34. There is a type of unhealthy obsession internationally with the way in which Israel is treated, and I don't stand there. Not that I'm not critical. My position, again, you can entertain two ideas at the same time. Not that my position isn't critical as far as it goes, but I'm very disquieted at disproportionality with regard to the criticism that it gets. Now, I know all the retorts and the answers. Israel gets $3.5 billion of American foreign aid. True. Egypt gets $2.5 billion. But my goodness, dare to protest the Sisi regime, and you will find yourself before a trumped-up military tribunal and face the executioner, or you will find yourself in prison, assuredly tortured for what you do. Okay, so again, questions of proportionality, and for that reason, why am I saying this? I'm saying this because when it comes up in class with my Muslim and in some cases Palestinian students in the class, and I raise this issue in my human rights classes, you know what? The students will debate me. They will disagree, but they are always respectful. They're their responses are measured and responsible. And I have never found a student, Arab, even Palestinian, who has fallen into a type of ideological, do you know what I'm saying, negation and so on and so forth. We have respectful dialogue, which just leads me to believe, and it may mean nothing at all, that in my view, a lot of this, the problems on campuses may be overstated. And a lot of it, I think, may not go on in classrooms itself. It doesn't in mine, even with the most contested, charged issues. I think it goes on, again, when various groups and clubs on campus invite speakers with very extreme conservative agendas and so on and so forth. That's where you mostly see it, okay? Just sharing that one anecdotal experience with you if you were interested, okay? Now, there has been trouble in classrooms at Columbia. Years back in the Middle Eastern Studies department, there was one issue with one professor who had a very strong anti-Israel position, pro-Palestinian position that was upsetting to Jewish students, and that got into the news and so on. But I don't think it's as broadly, it's as pervasive as sometimes the press puts it out to be. Okay, now, going further about college campuses and speech, there's been discussion about professors issuing so-called trigger warnings. Heard about this? Before material is presented in class, in that it may prove, the material may be proved to be especially upsetting to individual students who have suffered trauma or may be especially offended by the material. I must confess, I don't have much patience. Condemn me and string me up if you want. I don't have much patience for this approach. And it's not even clear to me that issuing trigger warnings have the type of effect that they're intended to have. If a student finds material, spoken material, and reading material so upsetting, she or he can absent herself. It seems to me, frankly, to strike me as a type of pampering extended to those who are privileged enough to go to college in the first place. It also seems, I should say more stridently, it seems patronizing to me. And one thing I personally can't stand, it pushes my button, I cannot stand to be patronized, and I don't want to patronize others. College students are supposed to be adults, and in my view shouldn't be treated like children when it comes to material, subject matter, or dialogue in the classroom. That's my view. Now, as I see it, life is hard, and the world can be a tough place, and not every environment needs to be made comfortable and pleasant in advance. While we should be sensitive and not go out of our way to offend, life is simply not a rose garden. Having said that, as a professor of human rights, and here I'm making an exception, okay, I did issue a trigger warning once because I thought the issue was very compelling, just to show that I'm not dogmatic, I can be open-minded, okay? That I did have a student who, in the introduction, when we went around, I asked the students to introduce themselves, came from a foreign country and said that she, in effect, had been a victim of torture in the country from which she came. And in that case, I did tell her beforehand that we were going to devote one of our class sessions to a discussion about torture, and she should feel perfectly free to absent herself if she wanted to. As it turned out, that was an extreme case, but quite interestingly, this one student said that she in fact wanted to be in class, and she did participate, and it was perfectly okay. It didn't generate problems. So again, there may be some places within some extreme cases where you would want to let students know that something may be especially, but as a general presumption that someone's going to be traumatized as a result of hearing things, well, I was a student once and never had, the benefit of trigger warnings and seemed to be able to survive 4 years in college. But, okay. But I'm not an example, too, because I walked to school through the snow for, half a mile. Love to tell my kids that, but they don't believe it. Now, I have no doubt that speech can be especially hurtful to historically oppressed and abused minorities. But even here, I conclude that not all members of minorities will, by necessity, respond in the same way. Some may choose to ignore insults, others may choose to hold counter-demonstrations, some may use the occasion to enhance public education about the history of oppression and exclusion. But I want to get back to the issue of forgiveness and how it relates to ethics, for this is really the mainstay of what I want to talk about. All that I've said before, up to this point, really is a very long introduction. But you don't have to worry, I'm just going to go on for another 5 minutes. And so on. Very long introduction. I think how we think about ethics can play a role in mitigating some of the tension in our public discourse, which again, I think is often too quick. We're often too quick to criticize and condemn. There actually are, to be technical, three approaches to ethics. The first two relate to how to decide what is right and wrong and good and bad, and require us to make judgments about ourselves and others, often stark judgments. The first is what is referred to as deontological ethics, coming from the Greek word for duty. Deontological ethics, its most influential authority being the German philosopher Immanuel Kant, has to do with in the most basic sense, with being obedient to ethical rules of conduct. If I teach my child that it is wrong to lie, cheat, steal, and it is right to be fair, just, and respectful to others, I am acting within the deontological framework of ethics. It is the ethical school which is most closely tied to making judgments about specific acts and the acts of other people. We would be inclined to judge someone ethically wanting if they were in any instance to lie, steal, or say something that was hurtful or insulting to another person. Indeed, we do this all the time, and very often it is called for and necessary. Indeed, judgment is essential for ethics, and sometimes if we are overly zealous or self-righteous, it can lead to a stance of judgmentalism, which, as I'm trying to say, can lead to social relations that are fraught, divisive, and strewn with tension. We are often quick to judge, but again, there can be no ethics without judgment. It's a fact of life. By the way, in terms of judgment, I judge it's getting pretty hot in this room, and if it gets any warmer, you guys are going to fall asleep. So, should we open the window, or it's just me getting heated? It is getting warm, right? Yeah. Thank you very much. The last thing I want is my audience to go to sleep on me. That's the first rule. Don't speak in such a way that your audience can't go to sleep. Okay, the second type of ethics, which I won't deal with to any great extent, also invokes rules, but it's somewhat more diffuse, and that is utilitarian ethics. Utilitarian ethics also deals with what is right and wrong, good or bad, and ethical judgments, and is derived from ethical rules. However, utilitarianism does not start with rules, but what is right or wrong has to do with trying to assess or project the consequences of one's actions. In briefest terms, if the results of one's ethical decisions brings the greatest good for the greatest number of people, the greatest happiness, then it is ethical and we should do it. Okay, point. But there's a totally different, and this is really the crux of my talk here, there's a totally different approach to ethics, and this is really my focus. Beyond asking what actions or decisions are right or wrong, for which we can hold a person to immediate judgment, ethics also relates, is the field of inquiry and activity that relates to the question of, quote, how can I live a good life? Which is an somewhat altogether different question. How can I live a good life? That's part of ethics too. That puts ethics in a different framework. Ethics, in this sense, asks what makes for a moral life as well as what makes for a moral life as well as a life that is fulfilling, satisfying, and happy. In short, at some point, this ethical approach joins together a life that is fulfilling with a life that is also moral. But it is ethics over a lifetime and not individual choices or acts that are really at issue here. This approach to ethics, which has its origins in ancient times but is recently receiving a revival in ours, is also often referred to as virtue ethics. It is something that I personally like a great deal, and indeed I see it as a softer approach to ethics than simply making judgments about what's good or bad, right or wrong. To understand how virtue ethics works, it's useful to look at Aristotle, who is arguably the father of virtue ethics. Aristotle, though not a scientist in the modern sense, employed biology as the basis for ethics, which he thought gave us clues to how we should behave if we aspire to live a good, fulfilling life. In briefest terms, for Aristotle, the good life is equated with the maximization of human flourishing. Human flourishing is equatable to happiness, and I sort of like that. It was Aristotle's contention that all living things by nature seek to maximize their potentials, and given the right conditions, they will. Seeds will sprout and grow into mature plants and flowers, and from little acorns, mighty oaks grow. Okay. And so it is with human beings. We all have physical, emotional, sexual, intellectual potentials, and much more. By nature, we strive to grow in mind and body. Through the choices we make, and no doubt a considerable amount of luck, these potentials can remain stunted or they can flourish. If they remain stunted, fulfillment and happiness will not be ours. But to the extent that we maximize our potential, to the extent that we flourish, we find fulfillment, contentment, and what we might call happiness. The Greek word Aristotle employs as a rough equivalent of happiness is eudaimonia. Daimon meaning one's spirit, related to a demon, but daimon meaning one's spirit and eu meaning good or well. So to experience eudaimonia is to be good-spirited or to have your spirit fulfilled. Again, eudaimonia is tagged to the idea of flourishing, which I think is a beautiful concept. But for Aristotle and virtue ethicists, there's more. In his view, in seeking to live the good life, we need to realize our virtues. Now, George Washington, the father of our country, who was very schooled in ancient thought, kept a little diary in which he wrote down the virtues that he wanted to fulfill, and each day he wrote in his diary the extent to which he was able to basically fulfill the virtues that he had identified. Thank you very much. Identified for himself. Okay. So, Greek philosophy was very big on virtue. And it's here that these ideas touch base with what we more closely understand by ethics. What are the virtues? Well, in Aristotle's reckoning, there are about a dozen of them. Among them are courage, temperance, liberality, magnanimity, patience, truthfulness, and friendliness. We become fulfilled, happy, and indeed ethical human beings through practicing the virtues. Practice is essential to Aristotle's version of the good life, which makes him a type of behaviorist. Indeed, my favorite insight from Aristotle appears in his book, The Nicomachean Ethics, named for his son, in which he writes the following, and I really love this phrase. He says, "The virtues are not given to us by nature, nor are they contrary to nature, but we are by nature fitted to receive them, and we perfect them through habit." Okay, that's nice. Would you be surprised if I told you I try to live my life that way? Okay? I find that lovely. We can ask ourselves, what kind of person do we want to be? And if the answer is, I wish to be a kind person or a compassionate person or a charitable person, then we need to go out into the world and do kind, compassionate, and charitable things. And do them over and over and over again until they become a habit, and we internalize them, and we become that kind of person. Aristotle says bluntly, if we wish to be courageous, then we must do courageous things. We don't first get our heads together, change our disposition from cowardly to courageous, and ipso presto find ourselves to be courageous people. Rather, to become courageous, we need to get off our duffs and start doing courageous things, and the internal disposition will follow. That's a good behavioristic norm, which the older I get, the more I become behaviorist. I mean, if you crawl around, spend your lifetime crawling around on your hands and knees looking for paper clips, eventually you're going to care about it, okay, and so forth. I mean, it sort of changes your mindset. Well, what virtue ethics adds up to, I admit, has great appeal to me personally, because it relates to, and this is really the payoff, it relates to the development of what we call character. That is, ethics to my mind in its richest and most far-reaching sense. This notion comports, I believe, with the aims of ethical culture. When asked what the ultimate purpose of ethical culture was, our founder, Felix Adler, did not say it was to pursue social justice. Rather, he said it is the development in each person of what he called ethical personality, which we can equate with ethical character. It is to grow in our ethical capacities for empathy, compassion, and for the respect for the humanity that is indwelling in each person and in ourselves. And this is a never-ending process and project, a project of a lifetime. And when we do this, we mold our characters. As I begin to bring this address to an end, let me try to tie this understanding of ethics to what I stated at the beginning as the prickly and harsh nature of moral judgment that we often witness in our time and in our current charged environment. As noted, we are fated to make ethical decisions in the moment, and those decisions often explicitly or implicitly follow rules of conduct. In numerous instances, life calls us to make decisions in which we can be honest or dishonest. We can choose to keep our promises or break them. We can choose to be generous or stingy. We can choose to treat others with respect, or we can violate and abuse them because of their race, religion, or gender, or because they're simply not like us and we don't like them. When we make such ethical decisions and act upon it, it is right for us to be held accountable in the eyes of others and in the eyes of society and in our own eyes as well. But what I'm trying to add to this ethical accounting is a second way to look at our ethical behavior and that of others. It is a way that I believe is thicker and richer. Starting with ourselves, we can begin to ask the question again of what kind of person do I want to be? And to answer that question, I think we can take on the project of virtue ethics. In other words, the process of living, perhaps its most important pathway, is the molding of our characters through the choices we make and what we do over the entire course of our lifetime. In this sense, ethics is more of an art than a science. The social psychologist Erich Fromm had a beautiful phrase in which he said that when it comes to molding our characters, we are, quote, both the artist and the object of our art. In the final analysis, we are all flawed, but sometimes we recognize people in our lives who have outstanding characters. They are generous and thoughtful, guided by fairness, compassionate and kind, and they're also wise. They are people who are simply beautiful to behold. Maybe they're even approach being human masterpieces in that sense. And when it comes to assessing others, no doubt, again, we need to hold others accountable for their bad moral actions. But what I'm calling for here, and this is the point of my address, is to assess those individual acts not in isolation, but within the context of and against the background of their entire characters. It is to see and assess others across the broad canvas of their lives. And perhaps if we do this, they take on a different significance. If we find that those deeds are out of character, this appreciation may enable us to assuage the harshness of our judgment, soften our views of the other, and open us up to a deeper understanding and ultimately to forgiveness. Without forgiveness, society again remains brittle and raw. Once we get beyond, I think, once we get beyond this time of political and social chaos and craziness, we will need to start down the road of social healing. In this regard, it will be good to remember, and I'm closing with this, the words of Martin Luther King, who certainly could draw harsh moral judgments, but those remain for him merely vehicles toward his final vision of human society. King had once written, quote, "We must develop and maintain the capacity to forgive. He who is devoid of the power to forgive is devoid of the power to love. There is some good in the worst of us and some evil in the best of us. When we discover this, we are less prone to hate our enemies." That's it. Thank you.